So, welcome back everyone, and yeah, let's continue working on our URL minifier. So, just to give you a small reminder, so what we did in a previous session, so essentially we built a web application which is able to shorten certain URL. For instance, if we just go here and put a YouTube here, the URL, if we click run, we will generate the short version of this URL. We paste it, we're going to be redirected to the original URL. So we can assume that this is working completely fine, and the only problem that we have is the fact that we are working at the moment exclusively with the file storage as our database. So all the data that is being used is saved in a JSON format in just one text file. So this is something that we want to extend, and what we need to do now is we would essentially need to build one more data adapter. And one of the most famous ways to do this is to build a database on the SQL Server platform. So in order to do this, you would obviously need to have SQL Server, preferably installed locally, but it would be also quite nice if you have SQL Server Management Studio. So when you have this studio installed, you have connected successfully to your database, to your server instance, you can go ahead and create a new database, and here we can just call it URL minifier, something like this. It doesn't really matter. So the only relevant thing is that the database name is unique. So let's just create this one, and right now the database is created. It's empty. It doesn't really have anything inside, and I can add a new table here, and the table will have two simple fields, so same as we had with our data adapter. So here we relied heavily on the shorted version of the URL and on the URL itself. So let's just quickly go ahead here, and we can say that we will have an ID, which is going to be a shorter version of the link itself, and original URL, for instance. Let's just do it like this. Let's change the data types to varchar. Let's say 100. I think even 50 would be more than generous for this one, and for this one, just for sake of it, 255. We will not allow any nulls, and we can set the ID as a primary key. And the table name, let's call it minify URL. Great. This is actually everything that we need to fulfill our requirements with this scenario. So what we can do now, we can hop back to Visual Studio. We can just stop this execution. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Entity Framework as a mapper of this database, and essentially we're going to use the Entity Framework to communicate with the SQL Server database. So in order to do this, I'm just going to create a new project. It's again going to be a class library, and I'm just going to click next, and essentially I'm going to call it AF model, something like this, so that just that I know what it is in the background. Quite simple. And let's just click create. Okay, so we have our new project. I'm going to delete the class, and now I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to manage the NuGet package of the Entity Framework model. I'm going to click on the browse and say Entity Framework Core. Perfect. Okay, I will need Entity Framework Core, but also I will need a couple of additional things. I will need a design, I will need tools, and I will need a SQL Server. Great. So the approach, obviously, which we're using here is a database first. So why the database first? Well, usually it is my preferred way to write a SQL on a SQL and to write C# in the C# places. So hopefully I'll have some time to explain my motivation to separate concerns in this matter. But I think it even might get a bit clearer as soon as I build the solution and generate the entity framework code. So how do we generate entity framework code? So essentially what we can do right now is we can just go ahead on a package management console. And what I will do now, just quickly, I'm just going to copy paste the boilerplate code used to generate the entity framework models. So this is that code. So essentially, I just copy pasted the correct database. So I'm just going to scaffold the DB context. I'm going to choose the server. That means localhost, URL. It's trusted connection. So my Windows authentication will do just fine. And I'm going to create a separate folder, which is going to be called models. So let me just run this. Oops, sorry. My default project was not correct one. So let me just go ahead and do it once more. Okay, your startup project. Sorry, let me just do this as a startup project. Let's do it one more time. Build succeeded. Great. So this is finalized. We have our code generated. So as you see here, we have our minified URL mapped exactly as our SQL Server table looks like. So ID and original URL, both of them are string. And if you go here in a context, you will see some basic information about it. One thing that I really don't appreciate here is the fact that that entity framework here, it does something quite mean. Essentially, he's adding here this connection string in the onConfigured options. So what I want to do here is I want to get rid of this, and I want to use this options builder, and I want to tell him to use SQL Server. So that's what I wanna do to him, and in this way he will not have any sensitive data inside the method or anywhere in the source control. And this is exactly what I was talking about when I said that I would like to split the SQL code and the C# code. So for instance, here in the C# code, you're using collation. It's written as a text. Yes, this code is generated, but it's just a magic string. And here you're specifying some very kind of sensitive information, and it's quite a lot, and something that you can do with the SQL in a minute. And I think it's getting especially difficult to configure all this in the C# when you have indexes, when you have, I don't know, triggers or anything like this. Then it's becoming a nightmare. But it's not all that bad. But one thing that we can do right now as well with the entity framework is, when we have already our packet management console, we can add a migration. So migrations are going to be quite useful for us when we want to generate a SQL script from this entity framework model. So I'm just going to call it init create. So initial seems that it's quite a big word for me. So in this init create, you see what exactly do we do if we want to go up, or what is going to do if we're going to go down. So up, we will create a table called minified URL, which has the ID of certain type, etc., etc. So quite simple, I would say. So now what we want to do is we want to use the mechanisms of entity framework inside our data adapter. So previously what we did, we built iData adapter, and our concrete implementation of this iData adapter was in the file storage data adapter. So what we want to do right now is essentially we want to add one more folder here, and we're going to call it EF adapter, something like this, let's say. And I'm just going to add a new class, and I'm going to call it EF database adapter. Let's just call it like this. I'm just going to click add. Let's make this public, and let's say that this is a type of data adapter. Great, implementing missing members, and we have clicked finished. So now you see that our data adapter expects, when we want to create something, it expects T of a type IBase model. And if we're retrieving something, we're also expecting to have something of a type IBase model. So now what I want to do is I essentially would have to write certain translators between those models. And this is obviously going to be the first step in our work. But I'm just going to give a chance for those two projects to communicate by adding a reference to the EF model, so that now EF adapter knows about this. And now in the EF adapter, I can create a new folder, which is going to be called extender, right? And extenders, even better. So here I'm just going to add one class, and this class is going to be called minified URL extender, something like this. I'm going to make this class public and static, and I'm going to say, just give it a second. What was our entity framework model name? I forgot. Minified URL. Okay, great. So public static minified URL. I'm going to say to minified URL, and I'm going to have this IBase model. I'm just going to call it data, like this. So from the generic type that we have, we will try to essentially build the minified URL. So what I'm going to do here, essentially, I'm just going to do a casting. I first have to remember what was, who were the users of my base model. So it is a URL mapper. Great. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to say var mapper equals URL mapper and of data. And now I can say return new minified URL, and I can assign ID is mapper.id, and I can say original URL is mapper.url. Okay, so I got this one. So this should work, I believe, quite okay. Now, the only thing is that I want to make this also a bit more generic than I would, I'm thinking in a way, okay, maybe I would in the future have multiple tables here. So let me go one level above this abstraction. So I'm going to add one more class here, which is going to be called generic interface extender, something like this. And let's go as well, make it static. And here, what I'm going to do is this is going to be essentially entry point for all extenders, for all of the extenders that we're going to build manually. So translation from one DTO model to the entity framework model. So here, what we will need to do, we will actually need to have two different types. One, the type is from which we are converting to something else, so from A to B. And the first problem that we have here is what kind of type is a minified URL? So it's none of the type, it's just generic. So even if we would, it's standard class, partial one. But if we would have another table, it would be just another table, and we cannot kind of extract the IDs or anything like this. And even better is, if we even say that the base here is the ID, it would not essentially do anything for us. So because every time when we would generate, it would get overwritten. So I want to have a new folder here, And then this new folder here would be extensions, something like this. And I'm going to have here something which is going to be called, I'm going to add an interface and I'm going to name it base SQL model, something like this. And it will be public. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to copy this. So essentially my base SQL model, all of my tables that I want to use and convert would have the ID as a primary key. And here I can add a new class, which is going to be called minified URL, same as it was this one, and I can make it partial because minified URL is partial, so I can just extend it. I just need to make sure that it is in the same namespace here. And now I can say that this is a type of iBase SQL model. So this gives me the opportunity that in my generic interface extender, I can actually tell, hey, you know what? You should convert from this iBase model to the iBase SQL model. And how do we do this? So I'm going to just have here the static method. I'm going to say public static TT this time. I'm going to say to-ef model, and I'm going to say TT, and I will have also T, and here is going to be T is going to be a DTO data, and where T is iBase model, and where TT is going to be iBase SQL model. So something like this. And now what I'm going to do here is I would have to also build a certain dictionary. So this dictionary would essentially have to return certain thing. It has to return actually this method. So how do I do this? So essentially I would just quickly go ahead and inside this extenders here, I would be able to add something which would be called something like EF model conversion dictionary, something like this. As well, static. And here I would say I would essentially build two dictionaries. One dictionary would be a dictionary which would map the extenders, so the extenders from a DTO to the entity framework, and another one would be in the opposite direction. So I would say here private static read-only dictionary, which would have a string that would be the string would be the name of the table or the object that I want to convert to something, and the other parameter would be a function, and my in parameter would be iBase model, and my out parameter would be iBase SQL model. And I would say that this is I would say that this is mapped to EF dictionary. Oh, great. Let me just put a capital here. Okay. And now I would say that this is a new dictionary of this, and I would, oopsie. So let me just do it like this so that I have a bit of a better overview what is happening. And here I can say that if we just go quickly in our extenders here, I have no, the other one, this one, I would have for the URL mapper, I will execute this method here. So now I'm going to say is for name of URL mapper, and I'm going to say minify, let me just see, minify URL extender dot to minified URL. This is what I want. This is exactly what I want. So this is actually the only one that I have wrote for now, because I will wrote the another one when we return when we write the getter method. So now if I just go quickly to the generic interface extender, what I can do here. So essentially what I can do here is I can say var resolver is EF model conversion dictionary, and I will say actually I have to have here some public method that is going to find me the correct implementation, so the correct dictionary value. And to do this, I will have to have a public static function, which is going to have base model and base SQL model, and I'm going to call a resolve to EF model. So usually this is the way how I write it. So yeah, it's quite boilerplate actually for me. So we will need some sort of type T, and we're going to say that T is going to represent DTO data, and this is going to be T is going to be of a type base model. And now I'm just going to say return map to EF dictionary, and I'm going to say the DTO data, and I'm going to just say get type, and I'm going to use a name. So the type of this guy is going to be, in our case, just a URL mapper, and this should return us the correct value. So here now what I can say is I can say resolve to the entity framework model, and even better, I can just pass the parameter that I already have, which is a DTO data, and I can just close this one, and I can say var result is going to be TT of resolver that invoke, and I'm going to pass a DTO data to this resolver, and at the end I'm just going to say return result. Great. So what would happen if we would have another table? Once more, we go here, and this dictionary would have one more implementation. So let's say if we have a user table here or something like this, we would have a DTO model in the code, some user DTO, let's say, and we would have the extender, same as we have right here, which would say from this base model, in this case, it is an base model, and it would convert it to the correct values right here. So now what we already have is, so let me just go here, and if I go just quickly to the entity framework data model, so what I would have here in order to create the records is I can say something like, well, I would actually have to first inject the context itself. So let me just say I want to build constructor public AF database adapter, and I'm going to use URL minified context, and I'm just going to say that this is a context. Let me just introduce read-only property, and here now I have the complete context. I can essentially work with him, and right here I can say, okay, var entity framework object is going to be was a generic interface extender. So this fine gentleman here, we're going to use this one, and I'm going to tell him, okay, I'm going to tell him, you know what, change this to the entity framework model and do this for I minified, what was the name? It was I base SQL model, and use, oh, I completely forgot what was the other one. It was I something. I think it was also something base model. That's it. base model. And here I'm just going to pass model. It would be better to call this data. So now from this data, I'm using my custom extender. I'm going to convert it to the entity framework. And then what I can do here, I can say context add entity framework object. And at the end, I can say context dot save changes. That's it. So this should work completely fine. But let's go and live a bit more crazy. I'm just going to create also a getters and custom get methods for those extenders, and then we can also do a get the get method itself. The process is essentially the same as we had already for the create one. So what we will do, we'll create, we don't have to create actually any more classes, but we will just go to the to our extender, so minified URL extender, and here we would just have something a bit different. We'll just say public static URL mapper, because we're going to convert our entity framework data to the URL mapper. I'm just going to call it exactly the same, to minified URL, and I'm going to use this base SQL, iBase SQL model, and I'm just going to say that this is a data, and then same as I did for the previous one. So I'm going to say var mapper equals minified URL of this data, and now I can just say return new URL mapper, and then here I'm going to have mapper.id and mapper.original URL, straightforward. So we have successfully built this extender, and now we have to go back again to the generic interface extender, and we see that the method is going to be quite similar to this one. The only thing that is going to differ is the base model is now going to the place of base SQL model, and the base SQL model is going to that place. So let's just do a small switch, and I'm going to name this to DTO model so that it's not the same name. Obviously, our code is complaining a bit because we cannot really use our previous dictionary, so we have to build a new dictionary. I'm just going to call this one resolve to DTO model, something like this, and then let's just create a method there. I'm just going to ignore it for now, it doesn't really matter. So again, we can do a bit of a copy pasting, and here I will just copy paste this one, and the dictionary here is going to be to DTO dictionary, and again we're changing a bit places of those two fine gentlemen, I'm not sure what is right, but essentially here I would say name of minified URL, and the extender would be this one, and this is okay. Oh, I forgot semicolon. Perfect. That's essentially it, and the code is going to be exactly the same. The only thing is I'm going to use a different dictionary. That's essentially it. So now when we have this, I can just go back and I can say to my generic interface model, I can say I actually already did this, and oopsie, something is not right. So here, let me just see, something is complaining. Resolver is actually an object. Of course, it's an object because we use this one. So let me just change this a bit, and let's just say that this is iBase SQL model, and then this is going to be here. Oopsie, and this is going to be here. Resolve to DTO model. Okay, now it looks a bit better, and here now we have our invoke operation. Great. So we have our converter, kind of generic one, to convert it back to the create, which is quite nice. So, sorry, to do a get. So how do we do a get? So first thing, we will need to figure out what is essentially the correct type. So what is the type of a T in this case? And to do this, we will just build here one more small dictionary. I'm just going to say type would be get correct type, and I'm going to pass a name, string name. And essentially what I'm going to do, I'm just going to build a quick dictionary, which is going to say, hey, for which type I'm going to return which value from the EF model. So essentially in our case, I'm just going to say var dictionary is a new dictionary and of a string and of a type, right? And my values here, I'm going to be name of, and I'm going to use a URL mapper, and I'm going to use type of minified URL. Okay, that is essentially it. And the type, obviously for a certain name, needs to be in this table. So I'm just going to say return dictionary, and the index will be name. Great. So we will get our correct type, and we will use this correct type right here so that we know what to search for in the entity with the entity framework or SQL Server database. So we say correct type would be get correct type for type of t dot name. Great. And then we say data would be context.find. We're using now correct type, and we're passing the ID of that type. This is a primary key of him. And now what I can say here, if data is null, I can just return a default value. And if it is not null, then I will say a DTO object, because it's kind of generic. I'll say now we're going to use this generic interface extender. Is generic interface extender. I'm going to say to DTO model, and for base model, and I base. What is the base SQL model? Okay, I base SQL. Why doesn't it work? Maybe I'm missing something. Let me just see. Okay, to DTO model. Oopsie. I'm going to say I base model and I base SQL model. Great. So now what I'm going to say here is I want to pass a data. This data here I want to pass to this generic interface extender. And if I do this, it might complain a bit because it is an object. He has absolutely no idea what he returned. So the only way to work with this is to cast it to iBase SQL model. So now he will understand what do we have, and he will be able to cast it, or actually convert it to our DTO object. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say return T of a DTO object, something like this. And that's it. That's the whole story. So we have our worst part of the job done. We have successfully created, hopefully successfully created, our entity framework model. So in order to do one more thing is we need to, as said previously, we would need to have, first of all, the registration, another registration for the for this new data adapter. So if we just go quickly here in the startup session, which we previously created, we had here the registration of iData adapter to use a file storage data adapter. So what we have to do now is we would have to do we will have to get the database context, because this database context is being used right here. And to do this, we will have to essentially do something like services that add db context for what was the name, URL minified. Okay, we don't have actually a reference here. This is something that I really don't like, to add the direct reference from the entity framework model to the web project. But in this case, I'm just going to do it. I'm not going to extract those calls to something else. Okay, so URL minifier minifier. Why don't I just go here and just copy this and say add this context? And now I have to do a bit of a code which is kind of always there. So I'm just going to say O, like O for options, and I'm going to say options that use SQL Server. And one thing that I would have to do here is I would have to pass a connection string. So passing a connection string is quite a simple operation. So let's assume that we will have our connection string inside the app settings JSON. We could say something like var connection string would be configuration that get connection string, and I can say minify database, right? Something like this. And now I can pass the connection string to my context. So essentially this is going to build context using the connection string. So at the moment we don't have any connection string. We will have to add it to the configuration of the application itself. One more thing that we need to do, we will say services that add scoped, and we're going to tell him that now for iData adapter, please use the entity framework database adapter. So that's essentially it. We will uncomment, we will comment out for now. We don't have any specific criteria when we will use the file storage data adapter. So we will always use now entity framework database adapter when we want to work with the data. The only thing that remains for us is essentially to write a connection string, and in the .NET Core it can be a bit of a tricky to do this, but I find it way better than it was before. So I will just say connection strings, perfect, and I'm going to say, what did we use? Minified database, and this is going to be let me just see, do I have anything from my package? Yes, I do, from my copy pasted value. Perfect. So in what I can see is that this is actually it. Let's try it out. Let's live dangerously. Let's try, is it working as expected? We have our SQL and we have our project. So here I'm going to say youtube.com, I'm going to run, and I can access my access link. Let's see, minified URL, and it is here. Perfect. Let's see, do we have a read? We do. Great. That was actually quite flawless. I'm a bit surprised that everything is working that great. So it is a bit of a shock, to be frank. Okay, so let me just see something here. I just want to show you one more thing. You see the unit tests here, they didn't get affected at all by us changing the data source. So they continue to work completely fine, because right here we use an interface, so iData adapter, which is just mocking the responses. So yeah, it seems that this is it. So thank you very much for your time. I hoped that you have enjoyed this. Obviously, just as a small disclaimer, this might not be the best possible way how to work with all this, but it is a way which worked completely fine for me. So if you think that something can be improved, something can be changed, feel free to send your suggestions. It will be well appreciated. So thank you very much for your time. Bye bye.